Let me introduce Chris very quickly. Although many of you are already familiar with him because he's very active in the San Francisco community, in his different projects and programs that he's been running for the last, he said, almost 35, since the 90s, right? Since the 90s, he's been the director of the since 1995 of Shaping San Francisco. I myself discovered Shaping San Francisco only a few years ago, shortly after I moved to San Francisco, and I attended some of his walking tours. And for me, it was really a learning experience when I was basically starting to, to discover the history of this city. He also runs the online archive foundsf.org, which is, if I'm not mistaken, is hosted inside the San Francisco Digital Archive, right, in the Richmond district.
We use the Internet Archive to store all of our audio and video, and then embed it in our website. But our website's actually hosted through a commercial provider that we pay for.
I see. Okay, cool. He also has really award-winning bicycle history tours, walking tours, and most recently bay cruises, bay tours that he just started resuming right after the pandemic, right, in July. He's been also one of the co-founder of the Critical Mass since 1992, and he also has been the author of 3 books. This Hidden San Francisco, it's his 3rd book, and his previous books have been translated even in published in Italy and Brazil, and he was able to travel all over the world presenting his previous books. So many of you already know Chris, but I'm sure this is very exciting to learn many other hidden stories and hidden secrets about San Francisco that we haven't heard before. And without further ado, I will give the stage to Chris. Chris, are you ready?
I am ready. All right. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here with all our effort to communicate to the visitors to San Francisco and oftentimes locals, more of what we know and more about the world that has shaped us and that we're fully embedded in. And I'm sure there will be things that I say today that some of you will know better than I do, because there's a bunch of specialists online here I can see already. So I'm looking forward to your corrections, your additions, your amendments, as the case may be. I always am quite clear that history is an iterative process, one in which we're constantly learning new things and adjusting and making our best efforts to understand the truth of what preceded us and what led to this moment. But we're always being introduced to new ideas and new information, and sometimes we just get it wrong. The other thing, if you're like I am, an ongoing storyteller of local history, you'll understand the drama of the game of telephone, where you tell a story and it begins to migrate. And so sometimes that happens to me. I hope it doesn't happen today, but like I say, I'm pretty aware of that as just a normal and inescapable factor of telling stories that you've known for a while over and over again, and then little tidbits of one story drift from one story to the other, and so on. So these are just interesting problems of how we understand the world and how we communicate about it, and things for us to all sort of check ourselves over and think about. So again, I invite you to offer your corrections and insights as the day it comes to. After I finish the presentation, I'll look forward to the conversation. So starting out, thank you, Roberto, and to the Tour Guide Guild, and thank you for the introduction, very generous. I've been doing this stuff for about a quarter of a century, and I stumbled into it somewhat ass backwards. I was doing other projects, Underground Magazine and various bicycling related projects, obviously Critical Mass, etc., and was often encountering what I consider to be an amnesiac culture, and was very frustrated by that. And so for that reason, I started pondering, and I had, for various personal curiosity reasons, been gathering and collecting photographs and maps and things that I would come upon in my life. I moved here in 1978, at the beginning of 1978. I grew up in Oakland, and before that, I was a little kid in Chicago, and I was actually born in Brooklyn, New York. But having gotten here in 78 at the age of 20, I moved to the corner of Haight and Cole, right off the corner, and was paying 125 bucks a month rent, and started canvassing for an environmental group and doing kind of typical kind of work. And I ended up going to San Francisco State back then during that dark year of 78, and didn't feel super deeply connected to the city right away because of being out at state, which feels like you're in another world. But over time, obviously, my life became very deeply integrated with the city, and I've been here for 40 plus years at this point. So during that time, I've met a lot of people. I participated in a lot of movements and social struggles, and I've certainly tried to keep my memories of those things alive and document them as best I can. And now having this avenue by which to transmit it, it's been really fun and exciting. You know, the online archive at FoundSF is a place to put these kinds of things, whether they're flyers or arguments or photographs or what have you. And then the book, Hidden San Francisco, is really very much of an outgrowth of the specific tours that I developed, partly to raise money for the project. So let me just launch in. So the beginning of the projects back in '95, when I was telling folks who were online early, that a big part of the motivation for the project was to try to, oops, wrong software here for me. Let's see, there we go. There. So you can see there the original release of our work was in January of 1998, and it had a big gathering at the Corrette Auditorium at the library, then still rather new. And we released our CD-ROM, which was the technology of the moment still in 1998. I mean, everybody kind of knew it was heading to the internet, but it was still too early, and the internet was not capable of handling the kinds of things we were trying to do. And we basically created essentially $1 million piece of software for free. I mean, we did it as a labor of love. Me and my colleague, Greg Williamson, was the programmer. Jim Swanson was the animator. There was about 100 people that had made various contributions to the project. And it was all done in the guise or in the moment in which interactive multimedia was the buzz. And we used that expression to describe what we were doing as well. But the idea of interactivity was not really the proper name for it. It was, you know, interactivity is something that goes on between human beings. When you and I are having a conversation directly, I don't know what you're going to do. You don't know what I'm going to do. That's interactivity. That's interesting. What goes on between you and a box, so you and a computer, is something less than that. We tend to think of it as glorified multiple choice in a box. And that was certainly true of the earliest iterations of our project, and I think it largely remains true, even though the nonlinearity and hyperlink capabilities of the internet give the illusion of interactivity. That everybody's had to put it in there for you. It's pre-programmed. But as you can see on the left, it was one of our many, we made about 6 of these public kiosks, which we rotated around the city in various branch libraries and community centers. There was one at Modern Times Bookstore in the Mission, one at City Lights for quite a few years in the basement. And the one that lasted the longest was at the main library, and that went on all the way till 2008, lasted about 10 years. And if anybody wants to do a research into the logs of what people looked at during all those years, I have those logs. They're all text logs, and for some data cruncher, it might be a really fun project. For me, it would be tediously impossible to even think of doing anything else with it. But so we came out with that, and we also came out with the CD-ROM, and hilariously, the CD-ROM only worked on Windows, so all the people in the Bay Area who in 1998 were still religiously committed to the Macintosh, which I was not. I had never been a Mac person, and I'd always been around PCs since 1980. I found it kind of mysterious that people were, you know, when the Mac had fallen to less than 3% of the market, and everybody was pretty sure it was going to die back for a period of time there. And so in '98, we rolled out our CD-ROM, and it was on a Windows-only platform. And it turned out that of all the people interested in history in the Bay Area and who would touch a computer as a meaningful part of their lives, that group subset was such a small number of the population. Of them, 50% of them were religiously committed to the Macintosh and thought we were working with Satan because we had put it out on a PC platform. So that was a little bit of a letdown for us, because we did lose a fair amount of possible CD-ROM sales in the early days of the project when we could have really used them. But anyway, on we go. So then one of the things that I did to raise money for the project was to start a series of bike tours. And in '95, the very first bike tour was on labor history, which I've always been primarily interested in labor and ecological history. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a second, because those run right through this book, Hidden San Francisco, is really primary themes. So on the left, there's the ecological history tour. We're standing at Shotwell and near 18th, where the neighbors have dug up the sidewalks and created these sort of green sewers, if you will, places where the water could go directly into the aquifer. And that was a big breakthrough right there in the late 90s. Now we kind of take it for granted all over the city. We've put in center medians in all these streets, and we've opened up a lot of the sidewalks for that purpose. So we made a lot of progress in a fairly short time of how to deal with some of these questions. And then below is the transit tour I did during Bike Summer '99. We were all down there by the the ferries and all the other kinds of shoreline transit history that was going on during that period. Now, of course, over the years, the project evolved, and some of the early guys who worked on the project with me left and got involved in other things. We had about a 3-year interregnum where it was just kind of, it stopped working. Like Windows XP came out, and our project stopped working. So we had to re-engineer the whole thing. It took several years. We realized we needed to go into a more open source, internet-friendly process, and it took several years to find a way. But during that time, I actually helped start Counterpulse, which is an arts project, art facility that now has moved to Turk Street, but used to be at 9th and Mission. And then Lisa Ruth Elliott, who you see her standing next to the column there with me in front of the Internet Archive, joined up with the project, and she and I have been co-directors ever since 2006 or so. And thank goodness, because as all of you who know Lisa Ruth, she's an incredible dynamo and really holds it together in many respects, and it's been a joy to work with for all these years. So one of the issues, of course, of doing this project, both online and even prior to that, when we were doing the CD-ROM, was just sort of the question of the structure of information. Like, how do you actually put it together when you're assembling a digital archive? All of that was new starting in the '90s. Nobody really figured it out. There hadn't been any, proper way of understanding information architecture that well developed yet at that point. And of course, when you start adding in hyperlinks and different kinds of ways of non-hierarchical, non-linear media forms where things can go sideways at any given moment by design, and you really sort of facilitate people hopping around and having this kind of somewhat unexpected non-narrative experience. How do you make that make sense? What's the process for that? And that was something we tried very hard to do, and we kept feeling like we were failing. And part of that was because things didn't really lend themselves to firm boundaries. Like even just the simple thing of drawing a map of San Francisco and saying this is this neighborhood and this is that neighborhood. Well, the boundaries between any given neighborhood in the city, there's dozens and dozens of maps that have tried to do this over the years, whether there's the census maps or the electoral maps or any of a number of other ones. And so when you draw the boundary between, say, the Castro and the Haight and the Western Addition and south of Market and the Mission, there's some really arbitrary choices to make about which street you want to draw those lines down when you get to the middle of the city. So that was one of the examples of that, but there's also many examples of different topics that are, not just one topic. So, a story of, say, for instance, some streetcar workers who go on strike in 1917. Well, that's a transit story, but it's also a labor story, obviously. And then if you think about sort of the deeper meaning of what kinds of transformations were going on in transportation during that time, where they were building the tunnel to the west side and starting to make possible the urbanization of the sand dunes out west, it becomes an ecological story quickly. So there's these slippery slopes and slippery, yes, literally, and slippery boundaries, especially between different kinds of categories. And the problems of coherence are inevitably in front of us. So having built this crazy and sprawling website now, FoundSF, which we've just hit 2,000 separate screens of material with some nearly 10,000 photographs and hundreds of videos, I'm very painfully aware of it becoming something like a Winchester mystery house of local history. Like you could just go up and through any kind of weird angle through it, and you could wander around and open a door and hit a brick wall, or open a window and it doesn't go anywhere, or goes into a building right next to it. Or those are metaphors, obviously, but it's something of the intellectual experience. Sometimes if you don't know where you're going, but you're following sort of links that appear, you may not find that that's a very coherent experience. So that problem then brings me right back to where we are today with doing a book, because it's oddly enough, it remains, after all these years of experimenting in this new media form, the most efficient and the best way of organizing material is into a traditional narrative arc that tells a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end, or some version of that. And so the book Hidden San Francisco seeks to do that, is to create a series of narrative arcs based on themes. And so the themes that I'm particularly interested in, you see here on the screen: labor and ecology, which I sort of touched on briefly already, but just to make the point clear, I come out of doing radical labor politics around this magazine, Processed World, in the 1980s that I used to work on, and I had been very involved from the mid-70s in anti-nuclear politics and door-to-door organizing around toxic waste and cancer and all these kinds of things. And so for me, I've always had both of these things in my mind together at all times, is labor and ecology. How could you separate them? And one of the oddest experiences that I had over the years was being involved in different labor struggles and realizing that nobody involved in the struggle that I was working on, whether it was the J.P. Stevens boycott or the UFW or what have you, would actually think very much about the environment or the results of the work that they did or the raw materials that they worked with, and how that was all fundamentally a question of ecology more than anything else. And then similarly, ecologists, who I worked with quite a lot over the years in lots of different capacities, almost always saw that as something that you do when you're not at work, is you work on ecological things, or maybe you get a job in an ecology organization to live out your idea of doing meaningful work, but it's still just a very type of sort of side on the side of the actual daily production of life itself, all the material goods and consumption goods and so on that we produce all the time. So to me, that was always a problem, and I've always been trying to get those two things into the same conversation throughout my life. And in some ways, this project has allowed me to really emphasize that dynamic between labor and ecology. Now, another binary that I think is really important in this understanding San Francisco is genocide and slavery. You know, this has now become a little bit more available to everyone, given the Black Lives Matter moment that we're living through. Slavery has become a lot more present, if you will, in our everyday lives again, because it never really got fully abolished in the deepest sense, because Jim Crow for 100 years and the failures of Reconstruction and the civil rights movement's shortcomings, et cetera, we are still in many respects facing the legacy of that time. And so it turns out that slavery had a much bigger role to play in California's early history than we normally understood. It's often been denied and glossed over that there was slavery in California, but thanks to the work of Benjamin Madley and his amazing book, American Genocide, the California Indian Tragedy, that came out about 3 years ago now, a really great book called Freedom's Frontier by a woman named Stacy Smith, which looks at a detailed look at California in the first decades and the relationship between free and unfree labor and different types of labor regimes in the West, and how that's what really influenced the entire country. It actually puts California a little bit at the vanguard of shaping labor relations, both antebellum and through the Civil War and beyond, in a way that I had never seen anybody else do. So it's a pretty brilliant series of analyses, but you cannot get away from the fact that Indian slavery was written into the California law from the very beginning of statehood. While African American slavery was officially outlawed by the state constitution as part of the 1850 Compromise, there were African American slaves in California prior to that time who were maintained in slavery during that time and into the 1850s, and many people were sent back to slavery in the South by California and San Francisco court decisions during the 1850s. And so there were some pretty important moments throughout that period. And then by the time you get to the Emancipation Proclamation, the state legislatures passed twice in 1850 and 1860 laws that allowed for the enslavement, the indentured servitude of Indians who were determined to be vagrants or somehow, or minors more often than anything else. Minors, both Indians and African American minors, were quickly put into the status of wards by courts, with or without parental consent. And so that became a form of disguising child slavery inside of the patriarchal family structures of the 1850s. So it was, I think Stanford was the governor in 1863, that when the Emancipation Proclamation went through, he had to quickly strike some of the clauses from the laws in California within the next couple of months because they were in violation of that. And genocide, of course, Madley's book really tells it in great detail, but from the time the Americans started coming in 1846 all the way till 1873, it was open season. And 18 different treaties that were tried to be organized with Indians in California were all refused to be ratified by the US Senate. And over $1 million was funneled from the US government to the California government to pay so-called militias for wars with Indians, which were almost 100% one-sided massacres. And all of this is extremely carefully documented in Natalie's book. So, you know, those are the foundational realities of California. And when we talk about the pioneer period and the gold rush, we very rarely get into the details of how grisly that really was and how brutal the first arrivals were and their relationship to that. So, of course, there's another binary war and anti-war. You can't talk about California and San Francisco especially without thinking about the war economy that it was founded on from the very get-go. You know, it's come California and San Francisco's beginnings is in the Mexican-American War, the seizure of all this territory from Mexico through venal theft, essentially, by James K. Polk. And then, interestingly, right from the early days of San Francisco, and certainly more prominently by the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, you have a very dynamic and recurrent anti-war sentiment that shows up sometimes literarily, sometimes journalistically, and eventually, of course, in our time, much more commonly as mass movements. But certainly since Vietnam, mass movements against war have been very common in San Francisco and the Bay Area. Modernism and Romanticism, I'll read you a little bit about that. I have an excerpt ready for you from the book, which I think serves that better than me kind of going about it a little bit more randomly. Almost everyone harbors at least a bit of romantic nostalgia for the city that was, especially if they never lived in it themselves. As a young urban center less than 200 years old, San Francisco tends to emphasize and glorify anything it can romantically claim as its history. In almost the same breath, San Francisco's long history of poets, writers, and iconoclastic journalists have repeatedly cast a sharp eye on the machinations of money and power here. Singers and musicians, many in San Francisco, wrote the soundtrack of the late 20th century, a heady mix of heart, hedonism, and howling opposition to the dominant society. Monopolists and militarists, politicians and businessmen have all been stripped bare by muckraking investigations and bawdy ridicule. This civic reflex comes into conflict with the untrammeled pursuit of the modern that San Francisco is also well known for. San Francisco is practically a laboratory of modern life, from its origins in land seizure and enclosure to the massive exploitation of nature and cheap labor, to the efforts to stabilize and maintain a world based on gross inequality, a collapsing environment, and hair-trigger threats of war, based on a new foundation of surveillance capitalism. San Francisco is a global city repeatedly regaled as a trendsetter, a city at the edge of the continent where countless thousands have come to discard old identities and resurface with imagined pasts and uncharted futures. Innovators have been welcomed by a bohemian culture suspicious of fixed truths, ossified class boundaries, and imported traditions. Music, literature, poetry, technology, art, cooperation, and collective invention have all flourished in San Francisco. The same cultural dynamism has also provided a rich foundation from which huge corporations have grown to straddle the globe, while their owners have exercised an enduring control over the city's growth and development. San Francisco holds a vital place at the heart of modern world history. The city's own saga is barely 200 years old, and yet those years straddle the US imperial push across North America and into the Pacific, the Industrial Revolution, and the emergence of class war, mass immigration and racism, technological breakthroughs from railroads to photography, agriculture to chemicals, machines to microchips, and more. It's also an epicenter for resistance to war, home to the beginnings of the anti-nuclear movement of the 1950s, the neighbor-driven campaign to stop freeways in the 1960s, the unparalleled success of the Save the Bay movement in preserving and cleaning up the San Francisco Bay since 1963, and for changing how we live among ourselves by shattering norms of racial, sexual, and gender stereotypes. The city's immigrant ethnic groups continue to organize and resist the deep historical racism that has dominated elite policymaking here. San Francisco manages to be both a beacon to malcontents and nonconformists, and one of the most tightly run oligarchic municipalities in the country. The distribution of power and influence results from an endless tussle between competing interests, factions, organizations, and movements as they ebb and flow across time. Moments of contestation and conflict saturate our past, whether we know it or not, as our predecessors made decisions that continue to reverberate down the years. A definitive portrait of how we got here is elusive, but by revisiting locations and histories across the ever-changing landscape, we can uncover continuities and contradictions and present our version of how the city arrived at this moment. Like any history worth its name, it's not meant to be the last word, but a contribution to our ongoing shared efforts to understand how the hell it turned out like this, because obviously it could have been different. So that's just a little bit of the beginnings from that area of the section on, sort of the theme of modernism versus, and not versus, but and romanticism, because these things are always going hand in hand. So the four great, large chapters in the book are divided by ecology, labor, transportation, and descent. And they each have their own title. And then I'm going to give you a little bit of excerpts from each one. But I do want to mention that some of the things that I have done in this presentation when I did it for the Mechanics Institute and the library, I'm going to skip over today because I have since that time created a series of short videos that are essentially videos of the stops of which these particular parts are about. And you can see those on my website if you go to chriscarlsson.com. I think Roberta will post the links later, but it's chriscarlsson.com/hidden San Francisco with hyphens virtual tour. Or you can look up my channel on YouTube. There's a Chris Carlsson channel there with Hidden San Francisco as a sub.
I just posted that, Chris. I just posted the link.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. So that's just to give you a warning that I'm going to hit some screens here where I'm not going to tell you very much about them because I'm going to gloss over them. But I also am happy to take questions about them and give you more information after we get through it, just to sort of shorten the presentation. Because as you probably can tell by now, I talk a lot and I can go on and on. So rather than have that happen, I think better if I go shorter. So this particular juxtaposition is interesting. If you haven't seen that photograph on the bottom before, it's worth taking a moment to pause and look at that. The large building you see there is George Gordon's sugar factory, built essentially where Ringgold Alley is, which, by the way, if you haven't checked that out lately, it's off 8th and Harrison. And there's a whole series of historic plaques and displays that have been put in that small alley dedicated to the BDSM and gay leather scene. So if you want another layer of history that has appeared in this exact same part of town, is now quite present there. But back in this period in the 1850s, that was the very first sugar factory built in San Francisco. And as you can see, it was built amongst sand dunes. You notice that very large sand dune to the left side of the photograph. And that steam shovel in the front there has a sign on it that says D. Hughes, David Hughes Steam Paddy Works. And that's a reference, a negative, derogatory reference to the Irish labor that his technology there was replacing. Because with that steam shovel, he could move 2,500 tons a day of sand. And so very typically he'd come to some business owner or investor or speculator, land speculator, and say, hey, you've got that dune there. Wouldn't you like me to take it down for a price? And they go, oh yeah, that'd be great. So he'd run his little train out. You can see all the little train cars there full of sand and his steam shovel, and he'd start leveling the sand dune and putting all that sand into the train carts. And then he'd turn around and find somebody that had already speculated down at the waterfront on a water lot off the shoreline. But someday that's going to be land, right? And so he'd go and find those people and he'd say, hey, wouldn't you like a bunch of soil to turn your water lot into workable land? I can make land for you. And they'd say, sure, okay, I'll pay you for that too. So he was making money on both sides of this sand removal business. And he got quite wealthy. And within a decade, he'd pretty much flattened the South market. And that was one of the major technological transformations of our landscape during that time. So that comes up quite a few times throughout the history of the city, is this sort of reshaping and remaking both of the physical landscape to make it suitable for urbanization and economic development of various types, but also to fill in the bay. Because, for 100 years, everybody thought filling the bay was a good idea. There's never any objections at all. And part of that was because it stank. It was actually a disgusting mess. I mean, the normal smell of wetlands is already, for some people, disturbing because there's something rotting there when the tide goes out and it's muddy. But that's kind of an organic smell that some of us might enjoy. But when you add to it human waste and the waste of dead animals and carcasses from slaughterhouses and eventually industrial waste, it becomes pretty potent and pretty putrid. And so nobody thought access to the bay was desirable for most of the, first 100 years of San Francisco's life. It was considered a really awful place. Get rid of it, push it away, fill it in, block it off, use it for industry, but otherwise forget about it. So it took 100 years to come around to a different idea about all that. But anyway, so just to get you sort of primed to think about these things that way. So one of my favorite stories to tell, certainly it underscores the idea of lost landscapes of the city. Imagine, if you will, today's Transamerica Pyramid. It sits right on the corner there of Washington and Montgomery. And once upon a time, that was the beach. So as recently as less than 200 years ago, in 1837, the very first house had been built in Yerba Buena Cove by William Richardson, whose name now graces the cove up by Sausalito, Richardson Cove. And his son, Esteban, or Stephen, later writes a memoir called Dawn of the Dawns. And he recalls sitting on the porch while he's looking down at basically a 2-block length from our point of view, 2 blocks, about that distant. The house was approximately at the corner, right off the corner of Clay and Grant today, in the middle of Chinatown. So about 2 blocks uphill from where the pyramid is. And then he's looking down the sandy slope. There's no other buildings or anything around. And he sees the tide has gone out. So you have this huge mud flat, and you see all these fish, these huge fish, because in those days, the 1830s and all the way well beyond then, the bay was teeming with fish. You had literally billions of salmon pulsing through the bay and into all the major rivers of California on 3 major pulses a year. And you had all these huge sturgeon as well, and many other large fish. And so people thought, early arrivals from various whaling or other kinds of vessels that came to the bay, that they could get out of their boat and walk across the water, because the water was so dense with big fish. And so here is this young boy sitting on the porch and watching the tide go out and seeing the fish get beached, as they did every single day. This huge meal would show up on the mud flats around the bay. And there's a coyote and a wolf and a grizzly bear right down there fighting over that, right about where the Transamerica Pyramid is today. So that kind of level of natural wonder is a little bit hard for us to wrap our heads around, the way that people actually coexisted with large predatory mammals for thousands and thousands of years. They found out a way to live together. It wasn't really a problem. Similarly, you had this common experience in the early part of the 19th century of people being here in the Bay Area and finding, like in the month of October, that the sky would suddenly be darkened for days on end, 3-4 days at a time, because of the overflight of billions of birds. When was the last time you even saw the sun flicker for a second because of a flock of birds got in the way? I mean, it's such a rare experience. So that kind of abundance that once existed here is hard for us to even imagine. But that's part of why the people who lived here for thousands of years, and by the way, we are on unceded Ohlone territory, all of us here in San Francisco. This is still not our place, really. Those folks who lived here for thousands of years lived a very healthy and abundant life. They lacked for nothing. They really had everything that they could have wanted. But because of the way that they lived and the way they organized their life vis-a-vis their environment and their cohabitation with different species, when the Spanish arrived, they couldn't notice that there was actually a fairly sophisticated civilization of people here. Instead, treated them as some kind of subhuman diggers, as they characterized them. And that's a great loss for all of us. But in any case, going forward, how do we actually transform the world that we're in today towards a world that starts to approach the kind of abundance that once existed here? I mean, the bay should be feeding us. Most of it's too toxic to think about, but going forward, as part of learning about history, is thinking about what can we going forward from this moment too. And that's one of the things that I think about a lot. The cutting of the hills, the landscape. This is one of the first ones. I'll encourage you to go and take a look at the videos on the new collection of short videos that I've made on the Hidden San Francisco channel under my name and YouTube. And talks about the cut, Broadway cut, the 2nd Street cut, the Bernal cut, the cut of Irish Hill, which once upon a time was the 3rd peak of what we call Potrero Hill today. And all of those were cut mostly for access to shorelines and to make way for people to make money because the slopes were too steep. And certainly that was true here, going out to Clark's Wharf, Clark's Point at the end of Broadway, creating a solid landway to get between Portsmouth Square and the shoreline, not having to go over the Buddy Yerba Buena Cove. And then the 2nd Street cut was made because the guy named John Middleton wanting to make money off of his land south of Rincon Hill, which was 120 feet higher in those days. And of course, it's gone through quite a few transformations. And you can see I found a lot of cool extra pictures to add to that video. So I'll let you go look at that there. and get more of the story there as well. This story is also a video that I just finished. This is the one I just posted this week. I'm putting up one every Monday and every Thursday for the rest of August, and did all through July as well. And this is a hilarious story that, you know, it's not that well known, but part of the reason we have these huge eucalyptus forests all over California was because there was this huge speculative rush, wood rush, if you will, from about 1904 on, with all kinds of different entrepreneurs trying to cash in. And at one point there was even a plantation along Telegraph Avenue in Oakland with something like 30,000 eucalyptus seedlings. And it took about 10 years, but the Department of the Interior, the Forestry Department, finally came out with a study that said that the blue gum eucalyptus tree was essentially useless for all commercial purposes. But prior to that time, it had fed this frenzy of people buying seedlings and acres of land and planting them all over the place. And there were actually eucalyptus trees here from the 1870s on. People were importing them much earlier than that. Sucrose forest, as it was pointed out to me the other day, was planted in the 1890s, of course. I knew that, but the rush really led to a different level of planting and frenzy throughout the state of California. Again, you can check the video out about that one. One of the questions that, you know, frequently comes up in my mind, and people don't really have a very clear idea about it, but, you know, we love to eat. We're all probably about to go and have a nice dinner, or maybe you had it before we started. But, you know, we really care about our fresh fruit and produce. It's a beautiful time of the year to go to the farmer's market with all the stone fruits, and right now the lovely tomatoes are starting to hit and everything else. It's just a glorious experience. I go every Wednesday to the Civic Center Farmer's Market. But where did all this food really come from? How does it get like this? Was it always like this? You know, these are questions that come to mind. And of course, part of the magic of California cuisine is how many different ethnicities and nationalities have fed into it over the decades since California's beginnings of urbanization and becoming part of the United States. And, you know, Chinese had a huge impact on that. The Delta that we take for granted today was largely developed by Chinese labor who understood how to dike and make useful agriculturally delta lands, because they mostly came from the Pearl River Delta, not too far from Hong Kong. Back in the beginning of the 20th century, the local Genoese immigrants really dominated the farmers or the produce market down by the what's today just north of the Embarcadero Center area. All that got eliminated in the late 50s. Thanks to, that was actually the first targeted area by the redevelopment agency, which in my argument, broader and too much to give you today, is the redevelopment agency's function was to break up working class communities, not just ethnic communities, but places where people understood how to have a life beyond just being isolated individuals serving the needs of capital. So these photographs give you a little bit of a hint of where I'm going here, because what happened is that you have this sort of revolt against processed food that comes out in the mid 1960s, and part of that starts because of Rachel Carson's famous book Silent Spring, where she talked about chemically soaked food, and, you know, that this was actually not just poisoning people eating it, but also the people who were all the animals who were in the environment. So you had this crashing of, you know, pelicans and various other birds who's not able to reproduce, and all this kind of stuff going on. And it turns out that the United Farm Workers Union, which emerges in 1965 from this big strike in Delano, when Cesar Chavez and representing the Mexican American side of the farm workers community, and then Larry Itliong and a bunch of organizers in the Filipino American community, who were the other side of that workforce, finally found a way to work together. They had been sort of at odds for many years. And they came together and found the United Farm Workers Union, and it was based on the grape boycott that was the answer to the failure of that strike that changed things completely. Because for several years, people were in parking lots, not just in California, but all over the country, in supermarkets, in front of Safeways and Kroger's and A&P's, telling people, please support the farm workers in California. And, you know, that means, you know, we want them to get a union, we want them to get a decent wage. But the most important #1 issue, as described by Cesar Chavez, was stop spraying us with DDT while we work. Pretty dramatic to imagine that. And one of the early efforts is that UFW made an alliance with the beginnings of the Environmental Defense Fund, and they filed the first lawsuit against the use of DDT in the United States, and they won. And they actually got DDT banned, and it was a very important environmental decision that was taken in the early 70s thanks to that lawsuit. So that begins this, that's part of the sort of foundational reality of why we today can walk into a giant supermarket and see giant piles of pornographically perfect produce. It's because people on the left bought corporate agriculture and said, we want good tasting, healthy, organic food. And it took a long time for it to fully come about, but other pieces of the story are the food conspiracies that somewhat grew out of the diggers' experience in the 1960s of San Francisco, who started this whole concept of everything being free. And they did that by going around to the local farmers market down at Alamany and gleaning from the farmers, what are you going to throw away today? Well, we'll just take it and we'll go home and make a big soup out of it. And they did that every day, and they'd make a big soup and they'd bring it down to the panhandle and give it away for free to people. And then from that, many different people started getting the idea of, oh, we could cut out the middlemen. Let's go to the farmers directly and buy food as a group. And then we had these sort of buyers clubs, but they called them food conspiracies. And they had all kinds of funny names like the Ongoing Picnic or things like that. And there were dozens and dozens of them all over San Francisco. And they really started to kind of change people's relationship to the growers, to the producers of food. And the other thing that, of course, is going on during this time, or actually a little bit later than this, is the rise of the People's Food System, which is a series of stores that got created by lefty activists who were, in a state of revolt against corporate agribusiness and agriculture and chain stores and all that kind of stuff. And so all that stuff is in late 60s and early 70s then contributes to this sort of changing of what now, capitalism's so good at co-opting, which is, oh, your market preference is for healthy food? Okay, well, we can do that. And then eventually you get Whole Foods and Safeway and everybody with their whole organic sections and so on. So that's a little bit of the origins of all that. There's many more things to be said about it, but just to give you a very quick taste on that, that's one, literally a taste. I wanted to give you that to chew on. Labor, of course, whatever happened to the 8-hour day, that's the title of the chapter. And like I say, my experience was with office work in San Francisco in the 1980s, and then eventually self-employment as a typesetter and graphic artist for many years, and producing books and magazines and things like that. But it's really kind of impossible to talk about what happened here without going through the whole history of the general strike in the middle of the time of San Francisco's period of development. But to really get the proper understanding of the earlier, I think I already told you enough about the genocide and the slavery business of the early part of it. But there's another piece of that story that comes up soon after that, which is this. And again, I have a video that you can go and check. It's one of the little chapters that I made a video out of. But it's a very fascinating story. You've probably all heard some of the lore about the Barbary Coast and people going down there for a drink, and then somebody slips something into their drink, and they wake up the next day and they're at sea, and now they're stuck. They're at sea. They can't really get back, and so they ended up sailing all the way across the Pacific to Shanghai, and that's where the term Shanghaiing comes from, as you get shanghaied as you go, from once you've been conscripted into essentially sailing labor that you didn't really want to do. Now, remember, sailors were cutting edge industrial proletariat of the time in the 19th century. You couldn't have had any of the development of the economy without these huge numbers of men who were oftentimes willing, but oftentimes forced to work on ships. And once you got on the ship, you had no rights. And this is not well understood in the contemporary era. People don't look back on that time and think, oh, they were like slaves. No, but they were. And that is really a dramatic thing, because you get this sort of, if you look at sort of the lore of the sea and the old stories that were told, almost all of them end up talking about these incredible bucko mates, the first mates or even second mates, who were just sadistic maniacs who would beat people to within an inch of their lives. We had an article in our first book that came out with the beginnings of our project, the CD-ROM. The first book was Reclaiming San Francisco History, Politics, and Culture at City Lights. And in there's a great essay by Georgia Smith called About That Blood in the Scuppers. And that whole expression is actually derived from these sailors' tales, some of whom said they didn't feel like they were really at sea until there was blood running in the scuppers. And that was a direct reference to the kinds of physical violence being committed against sailors by the captain or the first mate or some of the other higher ups on the ship. And now sailors had to endure this because they had been essentially conscripted by crimps who were legitimate business people in San Francisco and in London and other cities, whose job it was to provide able-bodied seamen. And they did that by various means. Some of it was by slipping you a Mickey in your drink and knocking you out. Some of it was just getting you roaring drunk as you arrived as a sailor, and they got you so drunk and so convinced that they were going to give you a good time that you didn't really notice when you passed out that they were dropping you back into a rowboat and rowing you back out to another ship and sending you on your way, having already signed the papers on your behalf and cashed all your wages on their behalf. So there was quite an operation going on for quite a long time. And that persisted even though there was beginnings of a union movement in the 1880s and went into the 1890s. And Andrew Furuseth, sort of famously the leader of that union, the Sailors Union of the Pacific. But just to really heighten the point, I want to read you a brief quote from Bill Pickelhop's really great book called Shanghai and San Francisco, in which he's quoting an 1897 U.S. Supreme Court decision, Robertson versus Baldwin. The court, the Supreme Court of the United States in 1897, excluded civilian sailors on merchant ships from the 13th Amendment's protection against involuntary servitude, i.e. slavery, with the extraordinary rationale that seamen are deficient in that full and intelligent responsibility for their acts that is accredited to ordinary adults, and therefore must be protected from themselves in the same sense in which minors and wards are entitled to the protection of their parents and guardians. So that's 3 years before the 20th century. The Supreme Court is still saying that sailors have no rights and have to be treated as minors, that they are actually not protected by the ban on slavery. So that, in other words, they are potentially, and in many times reality, slaves of their captains, or as close as you can possibly be to that. They get paid, but otherwise, no rights. So when you think about the development of California in the 19th century, and that this is a decision of the United States Supreme Court in 1897 about sailors who were at the cutting edge of industrial labor, well, it looks like slavery was really quite normalized throughout the whole regime of developing the West. It couldn't have existed without it. Not only the slavery of Indians, not only the slavery of the African Americans who were maintained in that status for far longer than they should have been, but now we find out that it was also the slavery, the quasi-slavery, if you will, of sailors. That was a key element in the whole development of the West as well. So again, you can see that video about that. The 34 strike is a really huge story in local labor history. I tell it in arduous detail when you come on my labor history bike ride, and oftentimes if you get me alone, I'll be glad to tell you the full bloody version of it all. But very quickly, there's a huge strike in 34 that's on the waterfront. It's after 15 years of a broken unions from 1919 or 14 years. And it takes a very long time to kind of resuscitate and rebuild an independent union movement to overcome the gang bosses and the shape up that controls the allocation of labor on the waterfront. And it's a very corrupt system. The workers are very angry. It's at the depths of the Depression, the bottom of 1934. And they go out on strike after having a rank and file convention. And they maintain a very peaceful strike for 2 months, although it's constantly being provoked by police, sort of riding their horses into them and doing various things to get them riled up, but they maintain their discipline. And then by the end of June, the local business elite is in the press crowing, we've got labor licked, we've got them right where we want them. William Crocker, the grandson of the railroad baron, saying, yeah, labor, they're doomed. They don't have any money, they're tired, they're hungry, we'll win now. We'll do what we always do. And he was the head of the Industrial Association, which was a private consortium of large businesses who had $1 million anti-strike fund. And they brought in all these strike breakers, and the cops were essentially working with them, and they attacked the strikers on July 3rd, 1934. And tear gas was blowing up in every direction because there was competing tear gas salesmen in town giving their brand new newfangled technology to the cops, saying, here, use mine. No, use mine. And so all this tear gas is going off, and that's July 3rd. They drove a convoy of trucks out of Pier 38, trying to get it to the Garcia and Magini warehouse, which is right there across the street from the Giant Stadium today, with a plaque on the wall and everything. You could walk people right by it. And it took 7 hours to get it all there because of the incredible efforts by the strikers to prevent it. They knew everything was hanging in the balance. And then the next day is the 4th of July, 1934. Everybody kind of takes a day off. And then on the 5th of July, it's gone down in history as Bloody Thursday. And that's the day that the National Guard and the cops opened fire on the strikers, and they killed 2 and hit 70 more, sending them to the hospital with bullet wounds. And that just galvanized the Bay Area completely and turned the vast majority of the local population to the side of the strikers. And you had a spontaneous general strike begin from then across the Bay Area. People downing tools and stopping working all over, from Hayward to Richmond and Oakland and Berkeley and San Francisco, everywhere. And on the 9th, there's a huge funeral march. And then on the 16th is the official beginning of the general strike. And there's a clue there, which is that the official beginning means that there's now a strike committee that's been formally set up to run it. And that strike committee was taken over very quickly by conservative union leaders who spent the next 3 days undercutting the strike and authorizing people to go back to work. So within 4 days, it was over. And during that time, Frances Perkins, the Secretary of Labor of Franklin Roosevelt, first female Secretary of Labor, actually cabled him to say, oh, nothing to worry about, strike under conservative union leadership. And she was absolutely right. So by the 16th, the general strike is over, one of the most dramatic general strikes in the country and in American history, actually. And the poor longshoremen under Harry Bridges, this rank and file committee that has emerged, and then the seamen under Andrew Furuseth they don't like each other very much, but they're now once again alone on strike, and they have to decide what to do. So they agree to take arbitration and go back to work by the end of July, which, you know, at the time they did not feel like they won their strike. They really didn't feel like very good about it. It felt like a defeat. So when you read about it today and you read these stories about, you know, or you see murals like in the Rincon Annex, you know, strike one, you know, great victory for labor. That's not how it went down at the time. It was actually very different than that. But the good news was that the arbitrator's decision, because of the enormous ferment and social pressure from below and the violence and the strife going on in society in general, realized that real concessions had to be made, and so a jointly controlled hiring hall was set up under the joint control of the union, now independent union, which also got recognized, and the owners, and they got the strikers or the longshoremen got to vote in their dispatchers, and that really changed class relations in their workforce and on the waterfront. And from then there was the march inland, and it was a very long period of time over the next 25 years where you had heavy unionization of almost every part of San Francisco, to the point that in 1941 you had nearly 98% unionization of restaurants. Couldn't have had any kind of service in any restaurant without getting union workers helping you. But then at the end of World War II, it all starts to unravel. There's a huge counterattack by owners of business and capital. They begin to decentralize production, get manufacturing out of the city as quickly as they can, regionalize the economy, which is essentially a model for globalization. And then you get down to finally there's a lot more to be said here. And the big piece of this, of course, is the persecution of Harry Bridges personally and the attacks on the longshoremen for being communists all this time. And during that period of time, then that's through the 1950s. So by the end of the 50s, the longshoremen decided they got to make a deal, and they signed this first ever agreement of its kind, the M&M, the Mechanization and Modernization Agreement of 1960. And during that time, that allowed for the speed up of the work, and they traded control over the labor process, of which they had established over 25 years. They gave it back to the owners. They said, okay, you guys can decide how to run the business. We'll just take money and pensions, and we'll do what you tell us. And they also divided their own workforce between 3 tiers. So again, it's a long and complicated story, but another piece of that story is that because they signed that agreement, and the beginnings of containerization comes within 5 years, and it begins to move all the port activities out of San Francisco and over to Oakland. But Harry Bridges becomes recognized as a labor statesman. He gets appointed to the Port Commission, and many other longshoremen get jobs, like Bill Chester gets to run BART, and other guys running the redevelopment agency. And it's that period of time of the redevelopment agency where it guts the black neighborhood, the Fillmore, the South of Market fight that we ended up with Yerba Buena Gardens is actually a fight between big capital and big labor and the business and the government on one side, and these retired longshoremen and seamen on the other, old communists who had fought and won the strikes in the 30s and made the longshoremen into a democratic union, are now living in SROs around the 3rd and Howard and 4th Street area. And they're targeted to become removed so they can build a 70,000 seat football stadium and a bunch of high rises. And they put up a bitter fight. They succeeded. They changed federal law. They filed lawsuits. They had all this different committee, all these different groups of people supporting them in their fight. And it's because of their fight that we today have museums and Martin Luther King Memorial and 2 acres of lawn and performing arts centers and all that stuff down there, and the bowling alleys and ice rinks and children's museums. None of that would have existed if it hadn't been for those old commies putting up that big fight. So it's a fascinating story. It's much more long-winded. There's a couple more pictures of relevant illustrations for that latter part of the story. That building on the right there, it's the Harry Bridges International ILW Memorial Building. And that's one of the concessions that the redevelopment agency gave the ILW that property, along with couple of other ones in town for their participation in that whole process. Now we get to the transit. I'll be speeding right along here, give you a brief opening from the transit chapter. The 21st century Bay Area is covered in asphalt, highways, and bridges. The inexorable expansion of car ownership and car dependency for over a century has produced the paradoxical reality that the personal autonomy and mobility promised by the privately owned car has been overwhelmed by the impossibility of using enough land for roads and parking to make using autos convenient, speedy, or comfortable. San Francisco shares a predicament with the rest of the nation. The supposed popular preference for cars disguised as a puzzling and paralyzing chokehold on public policy and resources by the automobile, oil, and rubber industries. How did a region that was once crisscrossed by interurban trains and intra-urban electric streetcars, along with a booming ferry service reaching all parts of the Bay Area, providing transportation to more than 90% of the local population, come to this strange dysfunctional impasse? Not surprisingly, it didn't happen all at once. So again, there's multiple entries inside the transit chapter. Each chapter, by the way, is characterized by a long opening essay, of which I've been reading you short excerpts. And then one of the most interesting stories, when we did critical mass, we started that in 1992, and we really didn't know that there had been anything before our odd decision to start riding home together in a group, which is really what the gist of the beginnings of critical mass was just the idea that we wanted to do something agitationally with bikes that has some political meaning. And it was because all of us had different kinds of political backgrounds already, and then we were riding our bikes out of personal choice. Like, it was just a better way to get around, it still is. And so, we never thought everybody has to ride a bike. That's absurd. But, it should be possible to make that an easy choice for the vast majority of people who can and will ride a bike, given the opportunity to ride it safely and comfortably in an urban environment. It turns out tens of thousands of people will, once you give them the proper infrastructure, as we see every day in San Francisco now, how many massively improved streets there are for bike moving, although they're still far from what they should be, but they're a lot better than they once were. Anyway, that's all sort of where things went to. But in the earliest parts of the critical mass period in 92, 93, 94, we started discovering all these antecedents that we didn't know anything about. And a guy named Hank Chapeau came up with this amazing research where he found this giant ride. And as you can see, that San Francisco Call newspaper front page from July 25th, I think it is, 1896, where there had been a ride of 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 bicyclists riding up Market Street, just like we were doing in the 1990s. Here they were doing it exactly 100 years earlier. And of course, they had demands in those days. They were demanding asphalt and good roads. So it's a little bit of a funny irony to imagine that, sometimes you get what you ask for and it doesn't quite work out the way you planned. Because, of course, in that period of time, in the 1890s, there was this commonly held idea that urban America was going to drown in 9 feet of horse shit within the next 25 years, because that was still the backbone of transportation, was the horse. And, of course, the horse, like the car, has exhaust. Only it takes a slightly different form. It's not a gas that goes up into the air. It's a big pile of poop that lands on the ground. And so that was really a common issue all over America, was how do you get rid of the horse shit from the city streets, not to mention the carcasses of dead horses who would keel over after being mistreated by their owners. So curiously enough, in San Francisco, we had a fairly happy ecological solution to this problem, because the city elite had decided to build, in competition with their visions of New York and imperial San Francisco, a beautiful giant urban park on sand dunes. And so what did they do is they ended up taking a great deal of that horse shit and organizing it and sending it out and dropping it onto the dunes of Golden Gate Park. And you can, when you're out in Golden Gate Park, keep that in mind. It's a park built on shit. But anyway, that's just part of it. I mean, there's all this hay that led to the poop, right? You had to feed the horses, so we have to gas up our cars and all the other vehicles we use. And in those days, the source of nutrients and fuel, if you will, for the horses was actually hay that came in 350 tons a day at the hay wharf, which curiously enough is right almost exactly where the Giant Stadium is today. And they were offloaded there in Mission Creek, and then put on various types of wagons and conveyances and brought to all the stables throughout San Francisco, and 10,000 horses walking through the streets at any given moment, chump, munch, 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 and poop, 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 and on you go. Nice little cycle of ecology going on there. Anyway, back to the cyclists. So they did put up a huge battle in those days, and they had all these different clubs and competition. You also had a lot of women who were changing their everyday lives thanks to the bicycle. They could change their clothing. The bustle began to disappear and get replaced by the bloomer, the actual separated leg pants, the sort of puffy pants that women started to wear during that era. And for a lot of women, it was a very early experience of some real liberation in terms of personal mobility, since everything up until then, in order to not be considered a fallen woman, you had to always have a male escort. And so suddenly on bicycles, women had the ability to move a little bit more freely and independently. And that accelerated from that time on all the way through women getting the right to vote in 1911, which I also have a little section on in the book. And there'll be a video coming out on that just in time for the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. The freeway revolt, again, I do have a video on this, so I'll let you go and check that out for the more long version of this. But it is fascinating to look at that map and realize that that was the plan for San Francisco, was to crisscross the city with elevated freeways, and in some areas tunneled, and many areas just above ground. They were going to go right down the middle of the Panhandle, right through the edges of Golden Gate Park, either above or underground. Glen Canyon would have had a big freeway, the Crosstown Freeway running through it. You can see it on that, going right to the edge of there where O'Shaughnessy Boulevard is now. San Jose Avenue, of course, is the Bernal Cut, and that was supposed to be turned into the Mission Freeway that would have bulldozed Guerrero and Valencia. Imagine having an 8-lane freeway there instead of today's Guerrero and Valencia streets. So an awful lot of the quality of life that we enjoy today is thanks to us being able to stand on the shoulders of the folks who put up the fights in the late 50s and early 60s to block this insanity of the highway builders that would have really altered forever the quality of life in the city. And there's a long and complicated story about the politics of that, about who took which sides. It turns out it was mostly the kind of conservative, more right-leaning politicians of the city who fought the hardest, voted most consistently against the freeways. Sue Bierman, then known as in the early 60s as Mrs. Arthur Bierman, helped found the Haight-Ashbury Neighborhood Council. Many other local neighborhood groups were founded during that time, in large part to fight the freeways. Groups that already existed, like the Telegraph Hill Dwellers Association, also were galvanized by this battle. Other groups on Potrero Hill were fighting them, etc. You can also see a little off the side of that bottom, there's a southern crossing, yet another bridge going across the bay over to Alameda from essentially the end of what was then Army Street, today Cesar Chavez, Pier 80 area. But just to the south of there is where Heron's Head Park is today, which was another attempt by the Department of Highways to build essentially a southern crossing and or more materials for a container port. So all that's complicated story is available also in Hidden San Francisco. You can check it out. And again, to get a much more coherent and longer, deeper view of the freeway revolt, check out the short video, and then there's lots of reading material and lots of visual maps on foundsf.org that you can read, not only about the freeway revolt back then, but the whole second round of freeway revolts that took place in the 1990s around the Central Freeway and the Octavia Boulevard and Embarcadero Freeway, etc. So check all that out. The last chapter is on dissent, and covers not just all these kinds of dissenters, but not just riots and demonstrations, but also literary dissenters and things like that. So I'll read you a little bit of the opening paragraph of this chapter as well. Generations of rebels, outcasts, contrarians, and misfits have come to San Francisco to change the world. San Francisco has welcomed them with good food and strong drink to a port city at the edge of the continent that seemed to have space for everyone and everything. Waves of creative radicals have washed over the city repeatedly, leaving their marks on music, poetry, literature, dance, photography, and painting. Others have reshaped sexuality, politics, media, medicine, transportation, and helped spawn the internet. San Francisco is the capital of the left coast of the United States, the home to the Beats, the Flower Children, and rock and roll. It's also where citizens have revolted against every war since 1898, where residents stopped freeways, saved the Bay, and fought the nuclear industry to a standstill, where in less than a decade, civil rights protesters ended discrimination in employment and housing and established the first university-level ethnic studies curriculum in the country. The explosion of gay liberation that made San Francisco its mecca starting in the early 1960s, and the longer thread of sexual and gender radicalism has also been prominently associated with a particular, even peculiar urban culture that has percolated and occasionally bubbled to the surface in the city by the bay over its entire history. The threads that connect dissent and protest in San Francisco can be traced back to the 19th century, even if they seem to erupt anew each time. So as you can see, those are some of the big, anti-war moments: the Vietnam War, 1999, or excuse me, 1991 Gulf War, and the 2003 protests, which quickly we forgot. And I remember a little bit of the motivation for our history project was actually that what happened with the 1991 Gulf War, because if you'll recall, there was like massive demonstrations in San Francisco, 150,000 people weekend after weekend leading up to it. And then, George Bush Sr. bombs the hell out of Kuwait and has his whole little moment with Saddam Hussein, his former buddy. And the anti-war movement vanishes very quickly because, there wasn't a war anymore after about a month officially, although obviously we continued to torment the Iraqis ever since. But interestingly enough, people have done an incredible amount of creative things during that anti-war movement, and it was pretty obvious that it was just going to vanish. So I was like busily gathering all these papers up, and other friends doing the Gulf War video project were documenting it on video, and it was a good example of the kind of motivations that I had for, like, we got to do our own history. If we don't write this stuff down, nobody's going to do it. There's not some other historian that's waiting for this to happen, and they're documenting it. If we don't tell our own stories, nobody will. And that remains a major motivation to this day. A good example of histories that get flushed down the memory hole: San Francisco actually had its own major uprising in Hunters Point, Bayview Hunters Point, in 1966. A young man named Matthew Peanut Johnson was running away from a stolen car, and a white police officer killed him with a shot, a pretty accurate shot, over about 100 yards, and killed him. And it led to many days of brick throwing, stones throwing, and tomatoes, and booing and jeering at the police chief and the mayor when they came out to the Bayview Opera House to try to calm people down. And there's some really interesting stories about that whole period of time, some of which we got from an interview with Tom Fleming, who used to edit the Sun Reporter. And that there's videos also. You can see Willie Brown as sort of a young politician out there trying to calm people down on the sidewalk, and then at a certain point he's in conversation, and then these white cops just come up and start hitting him with rifles and pushing him away, knocking him across the street, and he scurries away. But anyhow, this thing went on for several days. It led to Pat Brown, Jerry Brown's father, governor at the time, declaring martial law only in the black neighborhoods of San Francisco. So in Bayview Hunters Point and in the Fillmore, which of course extended all the way into what we call today the Lower Haight, even the DuBose Triangle a little bit, as well as the Haight-Ashbury itself, all were under martial law. And that meant that National Guard troops, who were basically 18-year-old guys, were empowered to drive through those neighborhoods in Jeeps with machine guns, fully loaded and ready to go, to keep the peace, so to speak. And so it was a very intense moment in San Francisco history. But there was very few white people who were attacked during this time. It was mostly businesses that got attacked, and mostly only known unfriendly businesses, which is a pattern you see very much in the George Floyd riots over the last few months, where the vast majority of what happens is people are angry at people who have been stealing money from them through the normal exploitative operations of everyday business life in America, exacting their revenge, either through proletarian shopping, or what some people refer to as looting, or other forms of intervention. So this was a pretty good example of that. It was actually a pretty lightweight one compared to what followed in 1967 and 68 in Detroit and Newark and places like that, which were much more intense. But it also did lead to a permanent reversal of fortunes for the Black community in San Francisco, because the insurance industry refused to pay any claims for businesses that lost their company, either their storefronts or their products or whatever. There was a general refusal to take care of those claims, and that led to a lot of businesses going under, and then those properties remained unoccupied or were soon sold to white speculators afterwards. And the organizations of the neighborhood were set back quite a bit by that. It took a while for them to resuscitate themselves, and by then the poverty levels were even worse than they had been already. And then, of course, the Hunters Point Naval Shipyard shuts down in 1974, and then really the economy of that area unravels pretty substantially from that time on. Interesting story about Alcatraz. We all kind of familiar with the Indian occupation of Alcatraz usually, and there's a funny story that precedes that I like to tell. I mean, the Indian occupation is so important and such a vital part of essentially the renaissance, the rebirth of Indian politics and Indian sovereignty in the United States. Many tribes have really resuscitated their energies since that time, since 69, 70, 71, in large part thanks to the American Indian movement and the kinds of things that came out of the Alcatraz occupation. But prior to that time, there was a brief period between 1964, when the first attempts by Indians to take over the island took place at the closure of the prison. And then there was, in late 68, the city decided it was their island to sell, and they sold it to the Hunt brothers, who were Texas oilmen. And their promise to the city, which is how they sold them on getting the island sold to them, and you can see that weird image of it over there, was that they were going to build a monument to the Apollo space program on half the island, and the other half of the island was going to be recreation of 1890s gaslight San Francisco. Now, of course, there's no water on Alcatraz, as you probably know, and it's a difficult place to service for all sorts of reasons, and that's part of why they shut the prison down. But anyway, that was the promise that the Hunt brothers made, and they were wealthy guys, and they convinced the city to do that. And then, as that became news, Jerry Mander, actually the publicity man for the committee, this improvisational comedy troupe in North Beach, and he was doing work for the Sierra Club and various other places like that. And he and Warren Hinkle, the famous journalist, were having lunch at Ernie's out there in North Beach. And they were so angry about the selling of the island. And they had this idea that they would take out a full-page ad in the Chronicle that would decry the sale of Alcatraz for less than Manhattan had been bought for by the English or the Dutch back in the day, you know, $24 worth of beads. So if you did the inflation, they paid more for Manhattan. So they decided to take out this ad, but they didn't have $5,000 to buy a full-page ad in the Chronicle. So they see sitting across the restaurant another somewhat known character named Alvin Duskin, who's running a dressmaking business over on Townsend Street at the time. He was a San Francisco native. And actually, I found out from interviewing him later that he was actually a fairly politicized guy. He'd actually been next door neighbors to Saul Alinsky for part of his life in the early 60s and so on. So anyway, he's a character. So they go over to Alvin and say, Alvin, you want to be famous? I said, what do you mean? And they explained it, well, there's this ad. We're going to prepare an ad, and here's the story about Alcatraz getting sold for so cheap, and we're going to say that's a horrible thing and they should stop it. And you could pay for the ad and sign it. It'd be your argument. You know, and he's like, let me think about it. So he spends 24 hours and he says, okay, I'll do it. And so he does. And the ad appears and it just sets off a firestorm. All the local news media is all over it. They show up at Alvin Duskin's house the next morning. They've got Joe Alioto, the mayor, on the TV saying, you know, who's this Alvin Duskin, this New York dressmaker? What has he got to say about how we dispense with our property? We can do whatever we want. How dare he say anything about it? They pan over to Alvin Duskin. He's just laughing and laughing. He can't stop laughing because it's so ridiculous. So what is he talking about? It doesn't matter where I actually am from here. I grew up in the Mission on 20th and Folsom, but you know, that's not really the issue. It's not where I'm from that's important. It's why are we selling this island to these Texas guys for such a cheap price on top of it? And so it leads to, there's coupons on the ad. So all these people are sending coupons into City Hall saying, stop the sale of Alcatraz. And so there's this huge political problem. And the Board of Supervisors actually votes to rescind the sale. And that leads to the Hunt brothers suing the city of San Francisco for, you know, reneging on the contract. And now this whole thing's grinding along in court. And then a member of the Inland Boatmen's Union calls up Alvin Duskin and says, Mr. Duskin, would you like to know what's really going on here? You know, I can tell you the real story. So he goes out and meets a guy kind of surreptitiously in a bar. And he says, look, here's the deal. The Hunt brothers don't give a shit about this stuff. They don't care about the Apollo thing. They don't care about gaslight tourist attraction, nothing. They want the island. And the reason they want the island is because the deep water channel coming through the Golden Gate goes right next to it. And these new oil tankers are too big to get to Richmond because of their deep drafts. So they want to put them into the bay and park them next to Alcatraz and offload their oil onto new facilities on Alcatraz and then build a pipeline from Alcatraz over to Richmond to the refineries. That's what they're really up to. And so Alvin calls up the Chronicle and says, hey, I've got some really important information for you to tell. So they put an article out about that. And the Hunt brothers quickly drop their lawsuit and they disappear and the story's over and nothing ever comes of it after that because they realize they've been found out. So that's
Okay, Chris. That was great. I was about to ask you if you wanted to take questions, or you have anything else you want to share with us before questions.
No, I can stop you there. I had a couple more screens, but that's fine. I can just fly right through them. Let me just see what's going on here.
Okay, that's great. So we just to let everyone know, the formal meeting will end like at 6:30, but we will stay a few minutes longer. We will end the meeting officially at 6:45. Thank you everyone for listening. We had 51 people connected, and we have few questions already. So Len, would you like to read the question to Chris?
Happy to read the questions. We've got some interesting questions. I'll start with one and encourage a really short answer, because of the long answer, I'm sure, is much longer. But in a very quick way, Ted Bagaman asks about the fact that you're an organizer of critical mass. Are you satisfied with the popularity of cycling today? And just one or two sentences, because we could spend the rest of the whole meeting on
Sure,
this,
yeah.
I'm sure.
No, I don't need to do that either. But I think that bicycling could be drastically more popular than it is. I think the recent closure of many streets for recreational purposes during the COVID moment has been really helpful. You'll notice that there's even more people that are using the bicycle for enjoyment and cycling. The daily use of the bicycle as transportation is the issue. And in order to do that, you really need to create safe cycling zones throughout the city. And the green separated bike paths are a big step in the right direction, but we need way more of that kind of stuff. So I'll be satisfied when you actually can go from point A to point B throughout the city without having to interact very much at all with cars and trucks and buses. That's what it'll take. And we really need to dedicate 10% of the streets of the city to cycling only, cycling and pedestrians, because why do we give 100% of it to cars and not give a very substantial chunk to bicycles? We're just as valid of a transportation choice, and in many respects a preferable one, thanks to the relationship to emissions and everything else. So long way to go, but progress has been made.
That's a great short answer. Jason Cohen asks, or states, that he's surprised that there isn't a plaque about Harry Bridges in Harry Bridges Plaza.
Yeah,
is there a story behind that?
Well, that's a great question, and there's actually an entry in Hidden San Francisco exactly about that. In fact, there's also a video of my little video collection. I only have like 9 videos, but we've hit all of them today on Harry Bridges Plaza, and that whole expectation that there would be a statue of Harry Bridges built and planted onto that plaza. That hasn't happened. Either the ILW is too cheap to pay for it themselves, or there's just never been any successful fundraising campaign. I don't exactly know how to explain that per se, but in fact, there is no statue, and there hasn't even been one floated as far as I know. And so, yeah, that's a missing element of the whole thing. But there's an interesting, more complicated story to be told about Harry Bridges, so that the attempts to glorify him might fall a little flat, given the actual history of the man and the actual history of the union over the years. And my book tells all about that.
Very good. Doubling up on Jason, why were conservatives on the side of the freeway revolt?
Well, I think there's an ongoing truth about San Francisco that many of you will be familiar with, which is a lot of old grumpy white people who just think the city's gone to hell, and it used to be great, and now it's gone to hell, and it's gone to hell for all kinds of reasons, and it almost always has to do with new populations, but it also has to do with change in general. Like, just why does it have to change? It's been so perfect for so long. Why are we letting things change? And so there's a conservative, and that's really the true meaning of the word, conserving things as they are, and don't let them evolve and don't let them change. And so I think that was a big part of the impulse. It was also driven, the campaign against the freeways was driven largely by middle-class women at home, people at home with children, who are also historically part of a fairly conservative part of the population. Housewives are not generally left-wingers. They're usually people who are trying to save family life against the vice and crimes of not family life, if you will. So I think that was part of what influenced those politicians to take that position as well.
Sure. Ellen Delora asked about posting a link for the recording of the presentation, and the standard practice for our guild meetings is that it takes sometimes as much as a day or even 2 days to do modest editing and getting the post up onto YouTube. We can't share the link until the video is actually up on YouTube. That's where we get the content. And as soon as that's done, I'll send out an email letting everybody know where that link is. Robin Bullard has an interesting comment to you, Chris. He says, your comments about the economy of the waterfront made me think of Eric Hoffer. I've found his writings and interviews very interesting and even inspiring. Do you agree with Eric Hoffer, or do you agree that Eric Hoffer has been forgotten in San Francisco, more or less? Any ideas?
Yeah, pretty clearly he has been. There is we do have an essay about him on foundsf.org. You can check out. It's a rather brief account of his work, and yeah, he kind of got a reputation as a right winger because he wasn't pro bridges and pro communism. So I don't think he was really a right winger by any stretch of the imagination, but he was a little bit more of a kind of a guy more mired in a philosophical approach to life and a less of a class-based approach to life, which I think is why he got that reputation amongst more knee-jerk leftists. But I think Hoffer's an interesting character, and like any working class intellectual who's worth his merits, somebody who's had complicated ideas about a complicated world. So good for bringing him up.
You mentioned Gordon's sugar refinery in the 8th and South of Market area. Who was first? I understood that one time that Adolf Spreckels built the first sugar refinery, but I'm not sure that's correct. So can you tell me the relationship between Gordon and Spreckels?
Yeah, Gordon comes first, 1856, but Claus Spreckels, actually the father of Adolf, was the sugar baron who got control over a great deal of the Hawaiian Islands sugar plantations already before the Royal House of Hawaii was overthrown by U.S. interests in the 1890s. And Claus Spreckels actually supported the Queen of Hawaii against that at the time, partly because he was in good with her and had all the sugar plantations over there. But he built the Western Sugar Works over there, right about they still see pieces of the brick walls of some of those original buildings down there at the end of 22nd Street in the Pier 70 redevelopment zone, where if you went to the far end of 22nd, you would see these large red brick building walls, and those are left over from the old Western Sugar Works. That was part of the Spreckels operations. And he went at a certain point in the 1880s back to Germany to examine how the German sugar makers were doing it with sugar beets. And then he came back with all these new technologies and was able to really kind of dominate the sugar business for a number of decades after that. And his sons were very wealthy men involved in San Francisco politics. Adolf actually was the guy who shot Michael DeYoung, second person to shoot Michael DeYoung and get away with it. Since apparently San Francisco juries considered it a perfectly reasonable thing to do is to shoot Michael DeYoung of the San Francisco Chronicle.
Right. I have a twofer from Anita Rao. The first question is, what was the height of San Francisco's multi-ethnic diversity in population? Or maybe we can make a general question about the fact that we've lost some of the ethnic community at this point. What can you share us about?
I don't have. Yeah, I would say that would be, to really get that, you'd have to go study the census statistics over the last 3 or 4 times, the last 3 or 4 decennial census. But we know we had a much larger black population. In 1970, it was about its peak, close to 100,000 people. Today, it's around 35,000. So we've had a tremendous drop off in the black population in San Francisco, too much to all of our detriment. And if you haven't seen the movie, The Last Black Man in San Francisco, I can't recommend it highly enough. It's a brilliant and beautiful and very poignant and sad film, but really well done. The Chinese population is much larger today than it's ever been, probably 35% of the city's population. So, that's a difference than in time in the past. And that really dates from 1965 and the change in immigration law. Latino population, we're waiting and not optimistic about what the numbers are going to be after the current census. First of all, we just learned last day or two that the Trump administration has cut off the census suddenly today. It's like, okay, we got enough. We don't need it anymore. And the chances that they did an adequate count in the Mission District, I'd say, are very low. As one example, but throughout this area, the Latino population remains. It's clearly still here, but it's also likely to have dropped considerably considering the amount of gentrification that's gone on in this part of town. And some people have moved to the Excelsior and other parts of the city, but it's also possible there's been a general decline absolute numbers. There's lots of people from other parts of the world that have come here. You know, we have more Africans and Cubans and all sorts of other people from other places on the planet that didn't used to live here, Cambodians and Vietnamese and Laotians and, you know, people from Indonesia and so on. So I just don't have the numbers. I couldn't tell you, but I'm guessing that we're probably equivalent diversity today or better than we've ever been. But the actual composition of that diversity is always changing, and it's worth paying attention to that too.
That's super. It is 6:30 now. We'll continue with questions for just a couple of minutes more. I've got a few, but we will close for sure at 6:45. Anita has another kind of a little more elucidation on the redevelopment and destruction of San Francisco neighborhoods. You talked about the produce market area and a little bit about the Fillmore. Can you give us just a little bit more on redevelopment?
Well, redevelopment was a national program set in motion by 1948 federal law, and almost every city in America took advantage of it to attack what was widely described as blighted neighborhoods. And the definition of blight, usually very quickly, the word dark came into it and dirty and things like that. And you find out that it was pretty racialized. So it was used again and again. I just read a really brilliant book about St. Louis by Walter Johnson called The Broken Heart of America, St. Louis and the Violent History of the United States. That's just an amazing book. Can't recommend it highly enough. And he talks about a guy named, what is his name? Oh, no, I've forgotten the guy, Bartholomew, I think it is. He's the Justin Herman of St. Louis. And then in our case, Justin Herman was the Robert Moses of San Francisco, Justin Herman was. And so we recently took his name off the plaza, the Embarcadero Plaza. He was a guy who was interestingly committed to public ownership. Like the Embarcadero Center, he was in favor of it remaining under public ownership, but the business elite were more powerful than he was, and they were able to get it actually sold off at pennies on the dollar. And now they all own, you know, Rockefellers and other investors own that area. But the targeted neighborhoods were, you know, the Italian neighborhood, the South of Market where the retired longshoremen and seamen were living, the Black neighborhood, and the Japanese neighborhood. Those were the neighborhoods, and they wanted to do the Mission. The Mission was targeted too, but it got voted down by one vote in the Board of Supervisors. Chinatown was also, you know, preserved from the scourge of redevelopment directly. So you have this sort of typical targeting of intact neighborhoods where people had a sense of memory of both political organizing and ethnic identity and social life that was something greater than merely being an isolated individual who works for wages. And you know, I don't think that Justin Herman and the people running the redevelopment agency sat around thinking about it with that level of coherence, but clearly they knew that their goal was to clear the neighborhoods that were potentially going to be much more valuable being put to other uses than housing working class communities. And the fact that those working class communities are also able to put up political resistance and political struggles only sweetened the pot for the people with the money who wanted to get rid of them. So there's a lot more to be said about all that. There's lots of essays and lots of books around. There's a book called The Contested City by John Molenkopf that deals with Boston and San Francisco in great detail and tells a very good lengthy history. And then of course, the go-to book for San Francisco is Chester Hartman's City for Sale, that tells the deep story of the South of Market struggles. So a lot of that's in short versions on Found SF. You can read quite a lot. There's a whole category under the themes. Go to themes and then choose redevelopment, and then you'll see there's probably 70 or 80 pages dedicated to redevelopment stories on our website.
Super. Barbara Demas, and I'm sure other people are asking the same question about purchasing your book. Can you repeat one more time what the easiest way to get your book is?
Yeah, well, the best way for me, and hopefully for you, because you'll get it quickly, is to order it directly from me. So my website with my name, chriscarlsson.com, and there's 2 S's in Carlson and an O. Then you have /Hidden San Francisco, the book, with hyphens between all those words and another slash at the end. And that will get you directly to the page where there's a PayPal link. You can also find that same link through the shapingsf.org website. Just look for the books and then follow your way through there. So there's a variety of ways to access it, but if you sort of search my name in the book, you're going to find that also, I'm sure, through a normal web search. But the easiest way is to go to chriscarlsson.com/Hidden San Francisco, the book. And there's also Hidden San Francisco virtual tour if you want to see all the videos I've been bragging about throughout the presentation.
I
Yeah,
can't
okay.
encourage.
Sorry to interrupt. I wanted to share to everyone that is still online. We are 37 people still that we have a surprise for you. The San Francisco Tour Guide Guild is going to offer 2 books, two of obviously the hidden San Francisco books, to you guys that are still with us. So I will ask Chris to pick 2 numbers from 1 to 37, and then we will assign 2 books to these lucky ones.
Awesome. I love lotteries. Let's see. 17 and 26.
17
17
and
26.
26. Okay, Helen, you got those numbers?
Yes, I do. Is Jim Wood still on here? Let's see if Jim's still on
Jim
here.
Wood is still on. He's here.
Jim Wood's a winner. And the next one would be a winner is Yvonne Huberman. Yvonne Huberman. Yvonne
Good luck.
Huberman.
Très bien, Ivan.
Congratulations, winners.
I got her.
Congratulations, guys.
Hey, Chris, this is
Yeah.
Helen, the
Hi,
president
Helen.
of the guild, and
Nice to see you.
it's so great to have you here. Thank you so much. We have
My
several
pleasure.
things in common. And I just was fascinated today by your book. I cannot wait to read it. It's like super now down my San Francisco nerd alley, which I love. I can't wait. And I just so enjoyed this so much. If you ever want to come back again, we'd love to have you. And
Sure.
we just, we always are hungry for these kind of deep, well thought out and just rich presentation of really what's the underbelly of what's going on and how San Francisco was created. And I just love it because I feel that San Francisco is this it's got such a, I'm from Baltimore, like I'm a 5th generation Baltimore girl, like long history. And then, but I feel like San Francisco has this history that's short, but it's so colorful and so robust and has so many tentacles that it's sometimes richer than other people's history that's been around even longer. So
Yeah, one of the books that inspired me way back in the 90s was the Baltimore book. I don't know if you ever saw that. There's a big walking tour book of Baltimore that was done by the American Social History Project out of New York. I don't know if you're familiar with Ray Rosenzweig. The American Association of American Historians has a prize in his name. He's now passed away, but he was one of the people who was very focused on Baltimore history, and they did a great job. I have the book on my shelf, so if you want to borrow it, I can lend it to you.
I would love it.
It's super interesting. It was a good inspiration for like how to think about social history and urbanism from a deeper point of view. Really trying to untangle the threads of how things develop over time.
Wow. Yeah.
I have one more question, which I think a lot of us would like to hear. Ellen DeLaura poses this question for Chris. How do we commingle tour buses that need to unload in areas where there's bike paths as well? Pier 35 would be an example. And we kind of need to coexist, but there are challenges serving these two communities. What thoughts do you have on that?
Well, I think there's a larger issue that you lead to with that question, and I agree with you that this is an issue that needs public policy to address it, and it's not doing that. It's ignoring it and pretending it doesn't exist. So part of it is we all need to be really cooperative and friendly and work it out with each other when we face these dilemmas. But ideally, the same problem exists with all the car services that are out there, Uber, Lyft, etc. Like it drives me crazy that these drivers just pull over wherever they feel like to pick people up and drop people off. And similarly with tour guides and tour buses, you need to have an organized spot that has been chosen by tour guides as a logical drop-off spot for all the different places that you want to have on a tour. And it kind of means that you're going to get into more of a fixed route, but I think in many cases that's not a big issue. You do have a fixed route and you're happy to have it. In my case, I'm constantly improvising new tours and coming up with new, spontaneous stops for walking or biking around. And we always are making a big issue with our attendees, like, please clear a path on the sidewalk. Make sure people can walk through. Enough room for wheelchairs, please. Pay attention to the world around you. You're not the only one here. We're sharing this space together. So I think there's an etiquette we can help impart to our guests that helps them understand that they're sharing the city with the people who are already out there, and that it's an active participation required from them. They're not just passive recipients of a tour. They're actually engaged in making history while they're on the tour, and they should take full responsibility for that and think of it as part of the fun of doing it. So there's ways to sort of present it to them, I think, that makes it come to life. But I do think that this is a larger issue for city policy. Like, why don't we have curb space set aside on every street that's only for drop-offs and pickups, and that those various people doing that business, whether they're using it as a consumer or as a driver, understand there's nowhere else to go to get a ride except for that two parking place with space with a bright orange curb or whatever the color it's going to be. And then similarly for tour buses, there's the different sizes. Obviously, you got your gray line and you got your smaller vans and all that stuff. So we sort of have to figure out who needs to stop where, and then have a proposal in front of the Board of Supervisors or the Department of Parking and Traffic and say, look, we need a solution here. This is not okay to just leave it as chaos. Let's have these are our proposals. We want these 15 stops. Make it happen. And I think they'll be glad to be given the guidance if we can present it to them as coming from the entire tour guide guild, along with the support of some of the larger tour companies in town, et cetera. I mean, I'm kind of out of that world, frankly. I haven't been signed up for either membership in this organization or formally with anybody because I don't do it as a living, right? I just do this as a sort of a way of sharing history as part of the larger history project. So it's kind of the tour guiding is both, it's common, but it's also somewhat incidental to what I do. So a little bit different than a lot of folks who are doing it for a living.
Well, you were sure made it.
Len, there was a question from Doug. Did you see it?
Right. I don't think we have time because we're at 6:41 right now, and I think we can communicate offline with Chris on that question.
Feel free, everybody, feel free to email me if you have questions about history, questions about things I've done or written or anything like that. I'm really easy to get hold of. You can call me, you can email me, you can come on my website. We can go out for a drink.
And I would encourage everybody to make sure they get a link to Shaping San Francisco's PayPal page or make a donation to the entity. We thank Chris very much for everything he's done, not only tonight, but for all the resources that all of us have used over time. And with that, Roberto, I'll say we'll close out the questions and you can close out the meeting.
Thank you everyone for listening. Thank you, Chris, for all your amazing information and stories. And we will send in a couple of days the email to all everyone at the register with the link, YouTube link to rewatch the video, the link to Chris' PayPal account, Venmo, and the link to purchase the book, and also to watch the short videos of the virtual tours that he mentioned on his website as well.
Great.
So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Chris. And
we hope to see you again.
Yeah, I look forward to it. Thanks.
Awesome. Bye,
Ciao.
everyone.
bye-bye.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Roberto. Thank everybody else for giving us all of your time tonight. We'll see you at the next meeting. And this will close the meeting. What do we say? The meeting is adjourned.
Meeting's adjourned. I'm at 6:45. Excellent job. Thanks, guys.